In defense of Dorian Gray. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 25 June 1890. Sir, I have read your criticism of my story, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I need hardly say that I do not propose to discuss its merits or demerits, its personalities or its lack of personality. England is a free country, and ordinary English criticism is perfectly free and easy. Besides, I must admit that, either from temperament or from taste, or from both, I am quite incapable of understanding how any work of art can be criticized from a moral standpoint. The sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate, and it is to the confusion between the two that we owe the appearance of Mrs. Grundy, that amusing old lady who represents the only original form of humor that the middle classes of this country have been able to produce. What I do object to most strongly is that you should have placarded the town with posters on which was printed in large letters, Mr. Oscar Wilde's latest advertisement, A Bad Case. Whether the expression, a bad case, refers to my book or to the present position of the government, I cannot tell. What was silly and unnecessary was the use of the term advertisement. I think I may say without vanity, though I do not wish to appear to run vanity down, that of all men in England, I am the one who requires least advertisement. I am tired to death of being advertised. I feel no thrill when I see my name in a paper. The Chronicler does not interest me any more. I wrote this book entirely for my own pleasure, and it gave me very great pleasure to write it. Whether it becomes popular or not is a matter of absolute indifference to me. I am afraid, sir, that the real advertisement is your cleverly written article. The English public, as a mass, takes no interest in a work of art until it is told that the work in question is immoral, and your reclaim will, I have no doubt, largely increase the sale of the magazine, in which sale, I may mention with some regret, I have no pecuniary interest. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 26 June 1890. In your issue of today, you state that my brief letter, published in your columns, is the best reply I can make to your article upon Dorian Gray. This is not so. I do not propose to fully discuss the matter here, but I feel bound to say that your article contains the most unjustifiable attack that has been made upon any man of letters for many years. The writer of it, who is quite incapable of concealing his personal malice, and so in some measure destroys the effect he wishes to produce, seems not to have the slightest idea of the temper in which a work of art should be approached. To say that such a book as mine should be chucked into the fire is silly. That is what one does with newspapers. Of the value of pseudo-ethical criticism in dealing with artistic work, I have spoken already, but as your writer has ventured into the perilous grounds of literary criticism, I ask you to allow me, in fairness not merely to myself but to all men to whom literature is a fine art, to say a few words about his critical method. He begins by assailing me with much ridiculous virulence because the chief personages in my story are puppies. They are puppies. Does he think that literature went to the dogs when Thackeray wrote about puppydom? I think that puppies are extremely interesting from an artistic as well as from a psychological point of view. They seem to me to be certainly far more interesting than prigs, and I am of opinion that Lord Henry Wotton is an excellent corrective to the tedious ideal shadowed forth in the semi-theological novels of our age. He then makes vague and fearful insinuations about my grammar and my erudition. Now, as regards grammar, I hold that, in prose at any rate, correctness should always be subordinate to artistic effect and musical cadence, and any peculiarities of syntax that may occur in Dorian Gray are deliberately intended, and are introduced to show the value of the artistic theory in question. Your writer gives no instance of any such peculiarity. This I regret, because I do not think that any such instances occur. As regards erudition, it is always difficult, even for the most modest of us, to remember that other people do not know quite as much as one does oneself. I myself frankly admit I cannot imagine how a casual reference to Suetonius and Petronius Arbiter can be construed into evidence of a desire to impress an offending and ill-educated public by an assumption of superior knowledge. I should fancy that the most ordinary of scholars is perfectly well acquainted with the lives of the Caesars, and with the Satyricon. The lives of the Caesars, at any rate, forms part of the curriculum at Oxford for those who take the honor school of Literae Humaniores, and as for the Satyricon, it is popular even among passmen, though I suppose they are obliged to read it in translations. The writer of the article then suggests that I, in common with that great and noble artist Count Tolstoy, take pleasure in a subject because it is dangerous. About such a suggestion, there is this to be said. Romantic art deals with the exception and with the individual. Good people, belonging as they do to the normal, and so commonplace type, are artistically uninteresting. Bad people are, from the point of view of art, fascinating studies. They represent color, variety, and strangeness. Good people exasperate one's reason. Bad people stir one's imagination. Your critic, if I must give him so honorable a title, states that the people in my story have no counterpart in life, that they are, to use his vigorous, if somewhat vulgar phrase, mere catchpenny revelations of the non-existent. Quite so. If they existed, they would not be worth writing about. The function of the artist is to invent, not to chronicle. There are no such people. If there were, I would not write about them. Life by its realism is always spoiling the subject matter of art. The supreme pleasure in literature is to realize the non-existent. And finally, let me say this. You have reproduced, in a journalistic form, the comedy of Much Ado About Nothing, and have, of course, spoilt it in your reproduction. The poor public, hearing, from an authority so high as your own, that this is a wicked book that should be coerced and suppressed by a Tory government, will, no doubt, rush to it and read it. But alas, they will find that it is a story with a moral, and the moral is this: all excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. The painter, Basil Hallward, worshipping physical beauty far too much, as most painters do, dies by the hand of one in whose soul he has created a monstrous and absurd vanity. Dorian Gray, having led a life of mere sensation and pleasure, tries to kill conscience, and at that moment kills himself. Lord Henry Wotton seeks to be merely the spectator of life. He finds that those who reject the battle are more deeply wounded than those who take part in it. Yes, there is a terrible moral in Dorian Gray, a moral which the prurient will not be able to find in it, but which will be revealed to all whose minds are healthy. Is this an artistic error? I fear it is. It is the only error in the book. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 27 June 1890. Sir, as you still keep up, though in a somewhat milder form than before, your attacks on me in my book, you not merely confer on me the right, but you impose upon me the duty, of reply. You state, in your issue of today, that I misrepresented you when I said that you suggested that a book so wicked as mine should be suppressed and coerced by a Tory government. Now you did not propose this, but you did suggest it. When you declare that you do not know whether or not the government will take action about my book, and remark that the authors of books much less wicked have been proceeded against in law, the suggestion is quite obvious. In your complaint of misrepresentation, you seem to me, sir, to have been not quite candid. However, as far as I am concerned, the suggestion is of no importance. What is of importance is that the editor of a paper like yours should appear to countenance the monstrous theory that the government of a country should exercise a censorship over imaginative literature. This is a theory against which I, and all men of letters of my acquaintance, protest most strongly, and any critic who admits the reasonableness of such a theory shows at once that he is quite incapable of understanding what literature is, and what are the rights that literature possesses. A government might just as well try to teach painters how to paint, or sculptors how to model, as attempt to interfere with the style, treatment, and subject matter of the literary artist, and no writer, however eminent or obscure, should ever give his sanction to a theory that would degrade literature far more than any didactic or so-called immoral book could possibly do. You then express your surprise that so experienced a literary gentleman as myself should imagine that your critic was animated by any feeling of personal malice towards him. The phrase literary gentleman is a vile phrase, but let that pass. I accept quite readily your assurance that your critic was simply criticizing a work of art in the best way that he could, but I feel that I was fully justified in forming the opinion of him that I did. He opened his article by a gross personal attack on myself. This, I need hardly say, was an absolutely unpardonable error of critical taste. There is no excuse for it, except personal malice, and you, sir, should not have sanctioned it. A critic should be taught to criticize a work of art without making any reference to the personality of the author. This, in fact, is the beginning of criticism. However, it was not merely his personal attack on me that made me imagine that he was actuated by malice. What really confirmed me in my first impression was his reiterated assertion that my book was tedious and dull. Now, if I were criticizing my book, which I have some thoughts of doing, I think I would consider it my duty to point out that it is far too crowded with sensational incident, and far too paradoxical in style as far, at any rate, as the dialogue goes. I feel that from a standpoint of art, these are two defects in the book, but tedious and dull the book is not. Your critic has cleared himself of the charge of personal malice, his denial and yours being quite sufficient in the matter, but he has only done so by a tacit admission that he has really no critical instinct about literature and literary work, which, in one who writes about literature, is, I need hardly say, a much graver fault than malice of any kind. Finally, sir, allow me to say this. Such an article as you have published really makes one despair of the possibility of any general culture in England. Were I a French author, and my book brought out in Paris, there is not a single literary critic in France, on any paper of high standing, who would think for a moment of criticizing it from an ethical standpoint. If he did so, he would stultify himself, not merely in the eyes of all men of letters, but in the eyes of the majority of the public. You have yourself often spoken against Puritanism. Believe me, sir, Puritanism is never so offensive and destructive as when it deals with art matters. It is there that its influence is radically wrong. It is this Puritanism, to which your critic has given expression, that is always marring the artistic instinct of the English. So far from encouraging it, you should set yourself against it, and should try to teach your critics to recognize the essential difference between art and life. The gentleman who criticized my book is in a perfectly hopeless confusion about it, and your attempt to help him out by proposing that the subject matter of art should be limited does not mend matters. It is proper that limitations should be placed on action. It is not proper that limitations should be placed on art. To art belong all things that are and all things that are not, and even the editor of a London paper has no right to restrain the freedom of art in the selection of subject matter. I now trust, sir, that these attacks on me and on my book will cease. There are forms of advertisement that are unwarranted and unwarrantable. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde.